Welcome to Szabo Cast. Here we discuss all things from a working class, trans, anarchist, analytical perspective. Due to the nature of this show, listener discretion is advised. My name is Skylar, my pronouns are she, they, they, and I'm your host. Thank you for joining us today.
Israel is a bloodthirsty settler colonial project. I did a previous podcast episode where I take a close look at the State of Israel's Instagram account. However, in this episode, I will be taking a far more in-depth analysis to Israel's current support base over their occupation of Palestine. I'm making this episode for a few reasons. Firstly, someone recently stated that there is more nuance to this conversation than Free Palestine and Ceasefire Now. I agree with this, but the nuance that they are looking for is not what they think it is. Hamas murdering people on October 7th should have never happened in the first place. People's lives were lost and hostages, including women and children, are still missing to this day as of recording. However, at the same time, as disdainful as Hamas's actions are, we need to remember that they only hold 56% of Palestinians' parliament, and they obviously don't make up the entirety of the Palestinian population. In the occupation against Palestine, Israel has already killed more Palestinians than Hamas has killed Israelis since October 7th. So bringing some numbers into this, I want to remind everyone that the attack on October 7th was a whopping 1,400 people who died. That's definitely a lot of people who did not deserve to be murdered. A lot of these people were just civilians whom otherwise didn't work for the State of Israel or the IDF. I'm only mentioning this because I'm aware that whenever we talk about death statistics, that these are just numbers, but that these numbers hold a lot more weight than just integers, and that we are talking about real people's lives. I want this to be extremely clear, that I am not discrediting or devaluing the number of Israelis killed on October 7th as we proceed with this podcast. Anyway, disclaimer out of the way, I'm going to continue. According to the United Nations, in a chart updated on November 16th, since the attack on October 7th, there has been a little more than 1,200 Israelis killed. So if we're adding this here, that makes 2,600 Israelis killed in total so far. Again, it's a very big number, nothing to scoff at, that's a lot of bloodshed. But now, we need to get to the Palestinian death toll, which is greater than 11,000 people in Gaza alone. That's just Gaza. And again, that is just since the October 7th attack. This isn't even to mention that these numbers are completely dwarfed to the death toll of Palestinians in the past decade. Last time we even came close, anywhere close for that matter, to these numbers were in 2014 during the Gaza war, with more than 2,200 Palestinians dying that year. So not only can we very plainly see that there is a bloodbath taking place surrounding this location, but that this is a very disproportionate bloodbath. Okay, so full disclosure, my computer had some complications. There was a part of my computer that needed to be replaced. Otherwise, I couldn't really use the computer. It was kind of, functionless. So I'm only mentioning this not because I'm looking for sympathy or pity, but because between the previous earlier part of this podcast and now, as you're listening to this, time has passed. And according to the UN, that death toll has increased from 11,000 to 13,000. This has been last updated on November 20th. However, some independent sources report that the death toll is much higher than that, ranging from 14,000 to 20,000. And that's because there are lots of people who are still not found, and they are trapped under the rubble from the constant decimation caused by the IDF constantly bombing them. So of course, take that with a grain of salt, but it's only because there are people who are unaccounted for in this statistic. The 13,000 dead Palestinians is the conservative estimate in this equation. I want to get a little anecdotal for a second, but I promise I'll be returning to using statistics, so don't worry about that. From my point of view, when the initial attack on October 7th took place, there was two main common consensus that I was seeing. The first that I was seeing was an overwhelming what seemed to be unconditional support for Israel bombing the shit out of Gaza and the West Bank. And of course, we're going to put a pin on that. But the second response that I was seeing was that Hamas royally fucked up and that Hamas completely jeopardized the entirety of the Palestinian population over in the occupied territories. This latter perspective was being parroted by left-wing sources, meaning that left-wing sources were blaming Hamas for what Israel was doing to the Palestinians. Now, I don't support Hamas. I don't support Hamas as an organization, but this feels a little bit like victim blaming in that respect, because in the previous podcast where we talked about Israel, for the better part of the century, Israel has not really given Palestinians an option for a diplomacy. So while I condemn the actions that took place on October 7th, you have to put into perspective that the Palestinian people were not really given much options in terms of their centuries-long occupation from Israel. Does this mean I believe we should be taking hostages and bombing hundreds of people to fight imperialism? No. I believe that's also punching down to the very people who did not consent to the existence of Israel as a nation state in the first place. But the nuance that I was talking about earlier is that Hamas didn't really have a choice in the matter. Because in light of all this non-stop violence, what other choice was there? This is where we're going to get to the meat and potatoes of this podcast. Because today, as I'm uploading this, it is Thanksgiving, which is a U.S. holiday to celebrate a genocide of the Native Americans, indigenous population here in the Americas. The genocide of Native Americans throughout the U.S. is so desensitized to the American collective consciousness that the holiday that is Thanksgiving has been completely sanitized. Because in the status quo that we experience here in the US, the idea of Thanksgiving is not commonly affiliated with genocide, but rather with images of cartoon turkeys, the pilgrims having lunch and dinner with the Native Americans, and that this holiday has peaceful origins. We all know this is not true. We all know that the pilgrims didn't just come from Europe to have lunch with the Native Americans in peace. No, we all know that there were over 100 million Native Americans that died from this atrocity. And it's important to remember that this wasn't just one day, it spanned over the course of 5 centuries. But I say all of this knowing that the younger generation of people are finally recognizing that this country was founded on bloodthirsty principles. Those principles being genocide, slavery, manifest destiny, laissez-faire style capitalism, which would evolve into neoliberal capitalism. And so when we talk about the Native American genocide and our relationship to the land that we are standing on, we need to remember that this land that we are standing on is stolen land. And the same can be said for Israel. Israel is stolen land. This is why when I see pro-Zionist Americans supporting the Israeli occupation in Palestine, I grow a little sick to my stomach. Because the way I see it, as a person who lived in a Western country that benefited from settler colonial imperialist violence, I believe what we are supporting in that position there is only the repetition of what we did as Americans here in the Americas. And that the 500 years of bloodshed and slaughter has really not changed, and that we learned nothing. And I feel like that is absolutely disgraceful. Let me break it down just a little bit here. This morning, actually over an hour ago as of recording this, Fox News released an article this morning with the headline that reads, "Christian leaders in Bethlehem defend canceling Christmas celebration to emphasize spiritual meaning." In fairness, it does quote the various patriarchs that are giving this justification for the canceling of Christmas celebrations this year in Bethlehem, But it also goes on to say in the middle of the article, quote, to date, there has been more than 1,200 Israelis reported killed by Hamas, while Hamas-run Palestinian Ministry of Health is claiming nearly 13,000 civilians have been killed by Israeli military activity in Gaza. End quote. Notice the phrase Hamas-run Palestinian Ministry of Health. That is a really, really sneaky way of Fox News instilling doubt in the figure that is 1,300, when actually this statistic has been used by the United Nations. Fox News, which is the most pro-establishment mainstream news network that I can think of at this time, is obviously a small part of a larger trend that is stemmed back to at least 2005, which is something that they have manufactured called the War on Christmas. Another topic for another time. Because while they're trying to sow the seeds of doubt with the statistics that 1,300 people have been killed by Israeli forces, it is actually because they are mourning for the loss of life in Palestine, in both the West Bank and Gaza. I'm going to read a couple short paragraphs from the New York Post who covered the same topic. This is what the article says. The reason is the general situation in Palestine. People are not really into any celebration. They are sad, angry, and upset. Our people in Gaza are being massacred and killed in cold blood, the spokesman said, according to the outlet. They added, therefore, it is not appropriate at all to have such festivities while there is a massacre happening in Gaza and attacks in the West Bank. To reiterate, this is from spokesman from Bethlehem, but we also need to reiterate that this is from an article by the New York Post, which is an American outlet. So of course they had to kind of like make their own spin on all of this. So I'm going to quote the article again. In 1950, Christians made up over 80% of the local population, but now hover around 10% in a Muslim-dominated region. Many Christians have chosen to flee the area due to persecution and religious harassment. This is once again a moment where we need to pay attention to these key phrases like in the Fox News article, like the phrase Muslim-dominated region. They want you to believe that the Muslims are the bad guys here. After all, Islamophobia is about as American as apple pie. But this is where we need to use our critical thinking skills, because let's take a look at the year that they have cited, which is 1950, because 1948 is when the Nakba took place. For those who don't know, the Nakba is a horrific event that took place in 1948 to displace and remove the Palestinian people from their land. This involved the stripping of their political rights and the complete decimation of Palestinian culture and society as a whole. I have a very close friend of mine who is a reformed Muslim, and they went to Palestine in the early 2010s and they learned a little bit more intimately about the Nakba. One of the things that they told me about what they've learned over there is that Palestinians tend to hold on to what are house keys. They're really old, rusty house keys. And that is because these are the keys of houses that have been bombed throughout the Nakba. Holding on to these house keys is a political statement saying that they did not choose to leave, that they were forced to leave because of the onslaught of bloodshed and violence committed by the Zionist movement. So, why am I talking about this? Well, in the New York Post article, it stated that Christians used to make up 80% of the population in Bethlehem, and has now been reduced to 10%. On top of that, they've also stated that Bethlehem became a place for harassment against Christians due to a quote-unquote Muslim-dominated region. This narrative is wildly horrible, and we need to talk about why it is horrible. First of all, the reason why it is now a Muslim-dominated area is because of the Nakba and the events following the Nakba, where Muslims, and specifically Palestinians, have been displaced from their homes. They had to go somewhere. And considering that Bethlehem is in the West Bank, this is where they chose to go. When you add that additional context that is being omitted from the New York Post article, it becomes abundantly clear that the New York Post is trying to insinuate that the Muslim population is killing off and committing some kind of genocide against Christians for some reason. But when you take into account the Nakba, it becomes clear that they didn't just move to Bethlehem en masse for no reason. They did so because they were forced to by the Zionist movement. The other thing I want to point out in terms of that article is that this is actually perpetuating the Great Replacement theory, which is a white supremacist conspiracy theory that believes that if there is diversity in any area, that there is going to be a decline in white population and that white people will inevitably go extinct. Again, this is a white supremacist quack job conspiracy theory. The reason why it is because if you believe that a diverse neighborhood or a diverse community is going to wipe out all of white people just by existing, then you're kind of advocating for violence here. That because diverse populations exist at all, you're going to have to justify continuously, violently massacring people groups, like literally in perpetuity here. And the common thread between this white supremacist conspiracy theory and this New York Post article is the fact that both of these things perpetuate a fear of elimination of an already privileged majority group at a global level. Christianity, without a doubt, has the most members out of any other religion in the world. It is the largest religion in the world. And by omitting the context of the Nakba in this New York Post article, it is, without saying it out loud, suggesting that we need to solve this problem by reversing this statistic. Now, as I mentioned before, the Muslim population has moved into Bethlehem because of the Nakba, but what do you think the suggestion would be to solve this problem by Israel? More ethnic displacement. Christians left Bethlehem because of an already hostile situation against the Palestinian population. And so while I don't doubt that Christians have been getting harassment from Palestinians over in Bethlehem, we need to remember that this drop in population didn't happen from massacres and bloodshed, but because of the massacres and bloodshed and ethnic displacement due to the Nakba. I want to go back to the Fox News article for a second, just briefly, to talk about the phrase, Hamas-run Palestinian Ministry of Health. This is an entire demonization of an official source. If anything, the use of that phrase is trying to delegitimize the officiality of, the official source. It's trying to discredit it, make you doubt it, make you think, nah, there's no way that 13,000 people have died because of the Israeli forces. No, they are faking it. They're lying to you. That's what they're trying to say, even though they don't say it out loud. It's a form of doublespeak. Whereas on the surface, this reporting sounds objective, but is it really? Because of its true intentions here. And on that note, I want to shift our attention to some video sources that I'm actually not going to be showing you, but instead, well, because this is an audio podcast, I'm going to be showing you with your ears, if you will. Especially in the previous month, I have never seen so much abuse towards children. I mean, I've seen videos of children's faces being completely unrecognizable. Like there's no way these children are still alive. So do not fear, I'm not going to be showing you or really even be playing you audio of children being killed, but instead I want to show you how Israeli officials are conducting themselves on the world stage. Especially in the media, because I think that's also pretty important to analyze how these interviews take place, and it's also a good opportunity to analyze the reporting of this genocide. Let's start this off with a fun one. The absolute unhinged ramblings of Israel's UN ambassador. This here took place earlier this month in November 2023. Take a listen.
Such as Dr. Tedros, such as Mr. Lazzarini of UNRWA, such as Mr. Griffith of OCHA, from all the other libelous UN organizations, committees, and also, sadly, from the Secretary General himself. they do not reflect the situation on the ground.
So just a quick pause to just reiterate that he literally just called almost everyone in the UN, including the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, completely out of touch with the situation in Gaza. In my previous podcast where we talked about Israel's use of social media, we talked about how they deliberately left out several portions of a New York Times article that was literally about the Yiddish language when they said that it wasn't about the Yiddish language and that they were accusing the author of deliberately not mentioning the Yiddish language in the article. But we later found out that the reason why they took issue with the article was because they called Israel and its military far right. So then what did it say about Israel's UN ambassador when you take into account that he literally just called a member of the Portuguese Socialist Party completely out of touch with what's going on in Gaza? After all, anti-Marxist sentiments is a pillar of fascism. But I digress, and I did cut this person off, so we're going to continue where we left off.
Yes, diplomatic niceties require us to thank them for their work. But sadly, they are relaying falsehoods that are completely detached from reality. For years, the UN has refused to establish verification mechanisms that can provide us a truthful picture of reality. WHO is it that supplies the UN with these so-called facts.
So, pausing again, the WHO is the World Health Organization. Anyway, let's continue.
Sorry. Who is it that supplies the UN with these so-called facts? Is this information coming from unbiased and impartial third parties? The answer is no. Every piece of information regarding the situation on the ground that this council receives comes from Hamas, not international UN employees in Gaza. I will remind the council that Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, controls every facet of Gaza.
Hamas is a political party that holds 56% of the parliament. Although 56% is more than half, the reality is a far cry from what he is claiming here.
Every number from the so-called Ministry of Health is Hamas. Many UNRWA workers in Gaza are themselves members of Hamas. The time has come to bust the myth of UN-supplied facts.
Oh, my God. Wow. For the record, when he says UNRWA, he's referring to a specific part of the UN, which is referred to as the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, and they typically tend to work with Palestinian refugees in this situation. So this fucking dipshit literally just called the United Nations and the World Health Organization, I mean, basically calling them Hamas and collaborating with Hamas. This is what I'm talking about. Do you understand how absolutely silly this is? How unserious this is? Part of the beauty of being an anarchist is recognizing that our world leaders are not put in their position of political power because they are justified or superior because of it. It's not like they're demonstrating riveting intellect here, because I would argue it's quite the opposite, especially in this situation, but because these representatives of these nation states are violent, bloodthirsty people who believe in the principles of might is right. And this fool of a UN ambassador to Israel is absolutely crying about the fact that journalists are taking videos of what goes on in Gaza and showing the world, and thus the world is starting to realize that the violence that is taking place in Gaza is absolutely not reciprocal here. In terms of Israel's public relations, it's not looking good, especially in its justification of its genocide on the world stage. Especially considering that this man is wearing a Star of David that is actually reminiscent of the Star of Davids that Jewish people had to wear throughout the Holocaust, which, oh my God, that is so loaded beyond belief. Like, do I even need to explain why that's messed up beyond belief? Because you're taking an entire demographic of people who have been the victims of genocide throughout history, not even just with the Holocaust, but like throughout European history, even up to today, of course. But now Compare that with what you're doing as a nation state, committing genocide. You are repeating history here. You're on the wrong side of history on this. You look like a fucking moron. I have to make a disclaimer before I say the following statement, because if I don't, it's going to be misconstrued, and I don't want people mincing my words here. So here's the disclaimer. I am not advocating for violence against anybody for that matter. I am speaking on completely hypothetical terms, and the following statement's purpose is to prove that there is a double standard with Israel and its attempt at justifying genocide on the world stage. Anyway, with that disclaimer out of the way, I'm going to say that statement now. A lot of the time when Israel tries to use justification to commit genocide on Palestinian people, they often use means of dehumanizing Palestinian people. Some more common ones are calling Palestinians animals or barbarians, while sometimes they will go ahead and cite anti-Semitism and homophobia. I want to focus on the latter for a second, because anti-Semitism and homophobia is not unique to Palestine. In fact, on the contrary, and we're going to talk a lot about that throughout the rest of this podcast. While I don't doubt that some Palestinians do harbor bigotry against Jewish people and the LGBT community, that is also true in the United States by not Palestinian people. Take Kanye West, for example, who was hosted on the Alex Jones podcast, and he was also guest starred with Nick Fuentes, a known neo-Nazi and white supremacist. To give you kind of an idea as to what kind of person Nick Fuentes is, here is Nick Fuentes himself.
I don't support women's rights. I don't support LGBT rights. I believe in race and gender essentialism. I'm Catholic. I'm a Catholic reactionary. I believe that organized Jewry is extremely influential in the United States and pushes America towards an open society, liberalism, internationalism for their own benefit.
Organized Jewry. If that is not anti-Semitic, I don't know what is, because holy shit. But he is one of many people who is influencing Kanye West, the most successful musician in the world. Although Nick Fuentes didn't say anything in the following clip I'm about to show you, I'm going to show you a clip from this, and I think you really need to just hear it for yourself on this.
I don't like Nazis, and I don't like what some of the mafias are doing either.
I like Hitler. I love Jewish people, but I also love Nazis.
Oh, man. Well, I have to disagree with that. You're not Hitler. You're not a Nazi. You don't deserve to be called that and demonized.
Well, I see good things about Hitler also, and I'm done with that. I'm done with the classifications. Every human being has something of value that they brought to the table, especially Hitler.
No, not especially Hitler. Hitler creating the goddamn Volkswagen bug is not a justification for killing 6 million Jews. But that is to say, the most successful musician in the world right now is spouting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and praising Adolf Hitler here. And that is to say, anti-Semitism is very mainstream, especially today in the US, in large part thanks to Kanye West. According to a 2022 hate crime statistics report released by the FBI, hate crime against the Jewish community has increased by 37% in 2022, and that number is expected to be even higher by the end of 2023. And this is just to reiterate that earlier clip of Kanye West talking to Alex Jones about Hitler and the Jews and so on and so forth, that took place in the year of 2022 as well. So this is my statement to the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations and his absolute crazy fucking tirades on the world stage. If all of the people that you are accusing of are either collaborators or just are Hamas, then why don't you do to those people what you do to Hamas? If your enemy is truly Hamas and you're calling members of the goddamn United Nations Hamas, and your solution for Hamas is to drop bombs on Hamas, then, well, I think you're in one way or another advocating for bombing the United Nations. And if you're truly committed to using these specific means to fight anti-Semitism in Hamas and Palestine abroad, then why don't you be consistent and do the same here in the United States? Here in the US, we have neo-Nazis. Are they not on your radar? Why? Why is that so? Because if this is truly your justification, and if you're going to be consistent with fighting anti-Semitism and homophobia within Palestine, then I think you would need to be consistent abroad across the entire world. And these justifications that you are using here is actually a real fucking thing in the United States. Dare I argue, it's a problem here in the United States, the anti-Semitism and homophobia here. It's a real problem, even at a legislative level in some cases. Keon Zimmer, PhD, wrote an academic paper for the University of Pittsburgh in 2010. This essay is about immigration and anarchism in the United States ranging from 1885 to 1940, and the essay is titled, "The Whole World is Our Country." I'm not going to read you the entire thing because it is incredibly long, but I'm going to read you a few excerpts here and there, and of course I'll put a link into the description for the entire PDF if you want to read it yourself. I'm going to do a little paraphrasing before I start quoting things, because in the thesis statement, they start talking about how anarchists were not anarchists when they came to American shores, when they emigrated, as a means to escape the Eastern European pogroms. On the contrary, Jewish people actually became anarchists because of the material conditions that existed within the United States. It talks about how New York City was a hub for Jewish and Italian immigrants, and how those people became anarchists because it seems that they weren't safe back at home in Europe, and they certainly weren't safe in the United States either. This is where I'm going to be citing the paper verbatim with quotes. In March 2020, Liberal Assistant Secretary of Labor Louise F. Post became acting head of the Department of Labor and began subjecting all deportation cases to close review, dismissing most of them for lack of evidence and outraging the Department of Justice. In many cases, for instance, those of Franz Whitmar, Alberto Guabello, and other Patterson anarchists, he had cancelled warrants even when sufficient evidence of anarchist beliefs existed. Of the more than 63,000 deportation warrants issued for suspected alien radicals between 1919 and 1920, less than 900 were eventually enacted, including those approximately 350 anarchists and UORW members, mostly of whom were deported under anti-anarchist statutes, were in fact socialists and communists. For the entire period between 1918 and 1925, the total number of radical deportees stood at less than 950. On page 330, it says, thus the vast majority of foreign-born anarchists whose deportations were legally mandated in theory remained securely at liberty in practice. This was only partially due to the inner bureau hostility. Although deneutralization of foreign-born anarchists was legally sanctioned, it involved a lengthy process that rendered it almost impossible. Emma Goldman's citizenship, for example, had been stripped based on a technicality regarding her former husband's naturalization, rather than under the anti-radical provision of immigration law. Individuals like Patterson Vermillion and Beniamino Mazzotta, who were deemed to take out American citizenship, were therefore shielded from deportation. So too was Carlos Tresca, for simple reasons that authorities were unable to ascertain his citizenship status. And that's the end of me quoting the paper. And I want to talk about this for a little bit, because this really tells me that the enactment of deportation of immigrants has a root in anti-Semitism. Sure, it was called the Immigrant Exclusion Act, otherwise known as the Anarchist Exclusion Act, but it was mostly Jewish people in Jewish communities who were being deported here. Especially and specifically noted Jewish anarchist activists, as well as socialists and communists. In a future podcast episode, I would like to do an episode on the southern border, but to keep it brief, I really think that there is a lot to say about the fact that what goes on in the southern border is rooted, very historically so, in the deportation of Jewish anarchists in the United States. But okay, you can err on some kind of plausible deniability that, yeah, they were just trying to go after anarchists, communists, and socialists. They weren't trying to go after Jews. It just so happens that a lot of Jews were anarchists. Well, first of all, that is a bit dismissive of a problem that the Jewish community historically faced, but I digress. Let's feed into that for a second, because if this was the only time something like this happened in American history, then I think that argument would hold its own weight to that level of scrutiny. However, I regret to inform you that that is far from the case. That is far from the only example of anti-Semitic legislation or anti-Semitic government action against the Jewish community here in the United States. I want to tell you the story about Herbert Karl Frederick Bahr. He was a 28-year-old man from Germany. In 1942, as a Jewish refugee, he was on a ship en route from Sweden to New York City. Herbert Karl Frederick Bahr was trying to seek asylum from the violence from Nazi Germany. However, a few days after he arrived in the US, the FBI began accusing him of being a Nazi spy, saying that the Gestapo had given him $7,000 to steal American industrial secrets and to give to the enemy combatants. They promptly accused him of pretending to be a Jewish refugee and that in hopes the country wouldn't notice. He was given an unfair trial and given the death penalty, and worst of all, his story would be used as a means to legitimize, along with the FBI, the State Department, and the President of the United States at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, argued that these refugees were a threat to national security. This isn't the only time this happened, of course. In 1939, the German ocean liner St. Louis had 937 passengers. Almost all of them were Jewish, and they were also turned away at the port of Miami. And when that ship returned to Europe, about a quarter of those people died in the Holocaust. You're probably wondering why this was even allowed to happen in the first place, especially with the hindsight that we have now on the sheer scope of the Holocaust. But the truth of the matter is that the United States' relationship with Germany at the time was strictly through foreign affairs. It's important to remember that Germany was an American business trader. We could talk about the creation of Zyklon B. We could talk about the use of Coca-Cola doing business deals with Nazis. We could talk about General Electric patenting specific oil for them to use on German planes. We could talk about the Union Banking Corporation of New York City, where Prescott Bush, which is George H. Walker Bush's father, and George W. Bush's grandfather, actually did trade deals with the Nazis, even having Adolf Hitler's payroll on their banking system. That is absolutely crazy. If you want to learn more about that, there's a really cool book called I Paid Hitler by Fritz Dyson. You should definitely look into that book if you want to learn more about the United States and Nazi Germany's economic relationship throughout its history. What I find kind of shocking is that even though Franklin D. Roosevelt said that Jewish immigrants were a threat to national security, one of the leaders of the German-American Bund went on to call Franklin D. Roosevelt Frank D. Rosenfeld as an anti-Semitic insult to say that his New Deal was a Jew deal. For fuck's sake. Do you understand what I'm trying to convey here? The United States' history is wildly goddamn anti-Semitic, and especially with some of its leaders, like in the Watergate tapes and what some of Richard Nixon's statements were on Henry Kissinger. I am going to such an extreme here that I am belaboring a dead-ass horse to prove my main point that the UN ambassador of Israel is so fucking hypocritical, really. Because my original point is that if Israel is going to use anti-Semitism as a justification for bombing through collective punishment, then I would argue that you would need to be consistent with the United States, who is actually funding this genocide in the first place. And I want to make it clear that I actually stopped giving evidence for anti-Semitism, not just in the societal part of the United States, but at a legislative level. I'm stopping because I am going on way too long about a tangent to prove a much broader point. And I actually have more to prove with that point. So a lot of you are already familiar with Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the Prime Minister of Israel, but a lot of you may not be aware of Isaac Herzog, which is the president. Yeah, they have two political leaders. It is kind of interesting. Like, it's a little unheard of for me because I've never even heard of a country having two political leaders like that. But at the same time, I mean, it's not the most offensive thing Israel has ever done, because what Isaac Herzog has fucking gone on to do with a PR attempt was really absolutely just batshit insane. Just take a listen.
Tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people supporting, by their demonstrations, supporting Hamas. I want to show you something exclusive, Laura. So this is Adolf Hitler's book, translated to Arabic, Mein Kampf. It's the book that led to the Holocaust and the book that led to World War II. This is the book that led to his victory in elections in Germany, which led to the worst atrocity of humankind, which the British fought against. Well, this book was found just a few days ago in northern Gaza in a children's living room, which was turned into a military operation base of Hamas, on the body of one of the terrorists and murderers of Hamas. And he even he wrote notes, he marked and learned again and again Adolf Hitler's ideology of hating the Jews, of killing the Jews, of burning the Jews, of slaughtering the Jews. This is the real warrior act. So all those who demonstrated yesterday, I'm not saying that all of them support Hitler, but all I'm saying is by omitting to understand what Hamas ideology is all about, they're basically supporting this ideology.
This is absolutely fucking bonkers. A child has a book that is translated into Arabic, and it's Hitler's Mein Kampf. Are you fucking kidding me? The performance Isaac Herzog just gave is the kind of performance I would give to someone if I was trying to strawman them. It would be like if I just said, okay everyone, do you know why we're bombing Palestinian children? You all need to understand the context behind it all, okay? We found this book, okay? And it was translated into Arabic. This is Hitler's Mein Kampf, okay? And if you don't take us seriously on the world stage, you are being anti-Semitic. Also, can I just make a very, very stupidly obvious point? Nazis hate Muslims too. Do you really think that Hamas is going to be using the literature written by someone who hates Muslims? And just be like, okay, my son, read this book that was written by a fucking rejected art student and just listen to how you hate the Jews. And that's gonna be your reason for fighting alongside with our cause. Use this fucking book that was written by a fucking anti-Semitic imperialist who did trade deals with the United States, who is also our enemy, and hated anyone who was as dark as us. Yeah, eat up this ideology here. Like, does Isaac Herzog here think we're stupid? A lot of people were saying that this book looked fresh and freshly printed. I don't think that really truly matters at the end of the day, because this performance of Isaac Herzog here, it's just absolutely fucking bonkers. Rarely do I ever call Godwin's Law on people, because the threat of fascism in this world has gotten so real these days, but this is the most abhorrent example of Godwin's Law that I have ever seen. It's almost as bad as when COVID deniers start calling the mandate a Nazi policy. I'm gonna move on from this point. I have more points to make. Can you fucking believe I have more points to make? Earlier this month, on November 14, was the March for Israel that took place at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. A lot of the signs were pretty awful, like this one particular sign that says, "Let Israel finish the job." A lot of people were chanting in mass, "No ceasefire." And what I find really weird is that they hosted a known white supremacist and anti-Semite, and his name is John Charles Hagee. Let's talk about Heggie for a little bit. He is what is referred to as a Christian Zionist. And we talked about Christian Zionism on my previous podcast episode in regards to Israel's social media, but for those who need a recap, Christian Zionism is the belief that Jews are going to go back to the Holy Land to be murdered, and then for all the Christians to go to heaven. That's already wildly anti-Semitic as it is, but wait till you hear what he has to say about Adolf Hitler.
Again he said unto me, prophesy unto these bones, and say unto them, O you dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. And he spoke to them, and they stood, and they became an exceeding great army, meaning they physically came to life. Now how is God going to bring them back to the land? The answer is fishers and hunters. The answer is given in Jeremiah 16, verse 15 and following. God says in Jeremiah 16, behold, I will bring them, the Jewish people, again into their land that I gave unto their fathers. That would be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Behold, I will send for many fishers, and after will I send for many hunters. And they, the hunters, shall hunt them. That will be the Jews. From every mountain and from every hill and from out of the holes of the rocks. If that doesn't describe what Hitler did in the Holocaust, you can't see that.
Throughout this sermon that he gave a couple decades ago, he would go on to essentialize Hitler's role in the Holocaust as a means to say that what he did served the better interest of the Zionist movement, even going as far as to cite Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement. Take a listen.
So think about this. I will send fishers and I will send hunters. A fisher is someone who entices you with a bait. How many of you know who Theodor Herzl was? How many of you don't have a clue who he was? Woo! Sweet God. Theodor Herzl is the father of Zionism. He was a Jew that at the turn of the 19th century said, this land is our land. God wants us to live there. So he went to the Jews of Europe and said, I want you to come and join me in the land of Israel. So few went. Herzl went into depression. Those who came founded Israel. Those who did not went through the hell of the Holocaust. Then God sent a hunter. A hunter is someone who comes with a gun and he forces you. Hitler was a hunter.
It's so fucking clear what he is actually saying as he is justifying the legitimacy of the Holocaust, which is so disgusting. What the hell?
And the Bible says, Jeremiah writing, they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill out of the holes of the rocks, meaning there's no place to hide. And that will be offensive to some people. Well, dear heart, be offended. I didn't write it. Jeremiah wrote it.
Yeah, but I am very confident that Jeremiah said nothing about the Holocaust.
It was the truth, and it is the truth.
No, it isn't. You sick freak.
How did it happen? Because God allowed it to happen. Why did it happen? Because God says, my top priority for the Jewish people is to get them to come back to the land of Israel.
Either he is wildly delusional or he is deliberately making a very evil fucking point here. Because I think the lessons that we learned from the Holocaust was that Hitler wanted to kill Jews because he thought Jews were the reason that Germany lost in World War I. I don't think Hitler gave a fucking damn about the so-called land of Israel.
Today, Israel is back in the land, and they are at Ezekiel 37 and 8. They're physically alive, but they're not spiritually alive. Now, how is God going to cause the Jewish people to come spiritually alive and say, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, He is God?
So there you have it. He literally just thanked Adolf Hitler for the existence of Israel, the nation state that exists today. And yet, he was a speaker for the March on Israel earlier this month on November 14, 2023 in Washington, D.C. But okay, John Charles Hagee is just a speaker for the event. I want to talk about one of the people who attended the event, in particular a Jewish woman by the name of Medea Benjamin. Medea Benjamin is a longtime political activist in the United States. When she was young, she was referred to as a nice Jewish girl. And from my research, she seems like a very progressive, forward-thinking person. And I say that as a compliment, not as like some passive-aggressive sarcasm. No, I really mean that some of her beliefs are very forward-thinking. She is the co-founder of an organization known as Code Pink, which is a predominantly anti-war feminist group. She also was a Green Party candidate in the 2000 U.S. Senate election for the state of California. She advocated for the end of the war in Iraq instigated by the United States. I could go on praising her, but I'm not going to because I would rather you do your own homework on that. But she was at this event, but she was also protesting against it. And there was an interesting interaction that was recorded between her and another person there, and I want to play that for you. I'm going to give you a quick trigger warning because there's a rape threat in there. So let that be your warning now.
I wish they will rape you alive. They will killing you.
Why don't you get kidnapped by them in Gaza and see if people come and save you? Because we should have a ceasefire and negotiate with terrorists. They're just going to say, oh, you stop bombing us, we'll stop bombing you. Here, take them back. Yeah, they'll just say, here, take them back.
That right there is a pro-Zionist heckler that just, wow. I can't believe she would say that to anyone who, like, what the fuck, at all. Medea Benjamin is holding a sign that says, Jews say ceasefire now, and this is how she responds.
Israel controls whether they have water, whether they have electricity.
No, we generously give them water. We generously give them electricity.
It's their land, my dear.
They have access to it.
It's their land that was taken
It's
from
not their
them.
land. Jesus was a Jew. Do you know that? He was born there. The Jews were there first.
Oh, there were no
Read the Torah,
Palestinians there?
read the Old Testament, read the New Testament.
Of course, and I know that there's over 400 Palestinian villages that were destroyed in 1948.
What they said about the nice Jewish girl is just absolutely true because she has like nerves of steel. She did not lose her cool once throughout this whole thing. And I say that because she absolutely would have been 100% justified if she had lost her cool. And more importantly, like, I just would have completely lost my cool then. Like, I don't think I would have been composed in that situation at all. So she really is just a true champion in that scenario. Meanwhile, this pro-Israel supporter with an Israeli flag like wrapped around her like she's some superhero, for fuck's sake. She's over here telling Medea Benjamin, a Jewish woman, that she hopes she gets raped and that Israel is generously giving Palestinians water and electricity. Just wow. Now, I did hear an unsubstantiated rumor that this woman who was screaming at her was under the influence. But even so, being under the influence doesn't make you so fucking hateful that you wish a Jewish woman would get raped. Like, I have never, ever noticed that in my life. Even if you're under the influence and you say something you're not supposed to, there's just like a specific level of like hatred and evilness that comes with wishing somebody get raped. You know what I mean? It's just, that is just despicably evil. The next thing I want to talk about is a piece of propaganda that I stumbled upon recently. I originally thought that this was a Saturday Night Live skit, and it was a really bad one. To my dismay, I was wrong. It's not Saturday Night Live, but it's actually Israeli propaganda. The name of the show in English is A Wonderful Country. And before we continue, I want to just talk about the name of the show for a second here, because this is supposed to be a satirical TV show in the same vein as Saturday Night Live. But satire doesn't really function in the way that this show does. In fact, this is more so supposed to be a show for stereotypes rather than satire. The entire purpose of satirical comedy is you're supposed to be putting the shortcomings of your subject on a pedestal and under a microscope for those to ridicule. Like the song Der Führer's Face. It's sad that I even have to explain the butt of the joke to explain how satire works, but the butt of this joke is that if you do a Sieg Heil in Der Führer's face, you're kind of like doing a sideways karate chop into Adolf Hitler's face. That's the point. And of course, we all know that the Sieg Heil is an allegiance to the Nazi power and Nazi party, so on and so forth. It's a sign of solidarity to the rise of fascism in Germany and white supremacy. In other words, it's meant to symbolize the cult-like mentality that comes with, you know, being a Nazi. So now, let's take a look at this skit right here that was produced by this show that is called A Wonderful Country. Is it really such a wonderful country? We're about to find out.
Hi everyone, we are live on YouTube with Colombia Anti-Semitic News, where everyone is welcome. LGBTQH.
H?
Hamas.
Yeah, I totally sim Hamas.
Yeah.
It's so trending right now.
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Do you know why it's true? Because it rhymes. Just look at all this toxic Zionist propaganda. Kidnapped in Gaza. Does this look like Gaza to you?
Yeah, but I have no idea what Gaza looks like.
And they're smiling. Do hostages smile? Zionist liars.
Totally sus.
Do they think we're stupid?
Stupid? I major in queer post-colonial astrology.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop it right there. You can kind of already tell where it's going. It's like this pair that has colored hair. They're meant to be queer-coded. They're supposed to be representing the LGBT community. They even go on to make a parody of the community name by including an H for Hamas. Like, it's really bad. And later on, after this point, they start to interview another character that is supposed to represent Hamas under the tunnel, under the hospital, and it's meant to signify that the LGBT community is sympathetic to Hamas for some superficial, first world, trending reason. And that, of course, is supposed to be like the shortcoming of the LGBT community, that the LGBT community is so dumb that they're willing to support anything as long as it is a trend. This is so tiring, especially considering that this is a wildly disgusting representation of the LGBT community. And, of course, representation in media is a huge talking point within the LGBT community because we are just historically misrepresented in popular media. I mean, no media is safe from this. It's even in something as wholesomely remembered as Cowboy Bebop.
Oh, that's cute.
Treat, please.
How's about a trick instead, huh, little boy? What do you say?
That's not a little boy.
Huh?
That's a little girl.
What? What are you trying to pull? You're gonna ruin my reputation.
That's from the movie, by the way, an otherwise very fondly remembered movie. Okay, back to the Israeli Wonderful Country skit, because we need to talk more about this. If it isn't obvious already, I am a member of the LGBT community, and I have never once, ever in my life, met anybody who supported Hamas from the community. Usually either they support Israel because they completely misunderstand the issue, or they support Palestine because they recognize this is a genocide. Nobody supports Hamas. I swear, like, how do you even come to that conclusion unless, of course, you believe that all Palestinians are Hamas? And in the previous episode where I talked about Israel's social media, we learned that Israel literally conflates Hamas with ISIS, even though they hate each other, and the Times of Israel has even reported on this, and they contradicted their own state media. I strongly recommend taking a listen to that podcast when you're done with this one if you haven't already. It's a pretty good one. It is also very revealing on how the state apparatus of Israel functions and what kinds of beliefs, values, and principles they want to instill onto its supporters. That last thing I spoke about, the skit from the Israeli sketch comedy show A Wonderful Country, it's not really satirical. If anything, it is self-serving rather than it is satirical. And it also says a lot about how the state of Israel sees the LGBT community. Whenever I talk to supporters of Israel, some of the first things that they go to when they discover that I am a queer and trans person is that they say that Israel has trans rights and queer rights. Well, my friends, what about the queer and trans people in Palestine? Because they exist, surprisingly enough. Even if you argue that Hamas is homophobic and transphobic, that doesn't excuse genocide. There is no pride in genocide. According to thepinknews.org, a queer teenager was killed in Israel after death threats from their own family members. Dorit Ahmed was an 18-year-old queer woman who was found with multiple gunshot wounds in the upper body in the middle of the street. She was receiving death threats from her own brothers, to which she filed a complaint, and the brothers got 3 to 4 months in prison, and the judge even went on to say, quote, "I have every hope that after this sentence, the parents will find the best way to return their little daughter to the family to take care of her in a natural way with the understanding and persuasion and not by coercion and threat." This is a very flowery way of the judge saying, well, yeah, the brothers are being violent, but I think the problem is the queer daughter in this scenario. And thus, of course, that's not what happened after the brothers got released from prison. I will go on to suggest that all of you go to read the article that is linked in the description, because it goes on to talk about how she's actually a member of the Druze community. I do not have any knowledge of the Druze community or enough to confidently speak on it, so I would rather that you all go read it to learn yourself on the matter. But I'll read this one passage to give you a rough idea as to what I'm talking about. Ahmed was part of the Druze community, sometimes described as a minority within a minority of around 120,000 people who form just 2% of Israel's population. Druze people practice a form of Ismaili Islam, identifying with the wider community of Lebanon and Syria, and some form of Arab nationalism. Although the Druze community have historically pledged loyalty to Israel for purposes of protection, some identifying as Palestinian, and have begun to refuse mandatory conscription into the Israeli army. So there is a few lessons to be learned from this story. One is that loyalty to your oppressors, in other words, becoming a pick-me in this scenario, does not save you from the oppression that you will get. If we learned anything from Ernst Röhm from the Nazi occupation, it's that being queer and aligning with the people who want to kill you will not save you. It's like being a sheep and then aligning with the wolf in this scenario. The second thing that we learned here is that Israel is not protected from scrutiny when it comes to the worldwide problem that is homophobia. It still exists within Israel, and it's a major problem. In fact, arguably so, with the judge's ruling, it is arguably lenient on the punishment for what happens if you are homophobic. And I mentioned earlier about the queer Palestinians and how some people believe that Palestinians just can't be queer because inherently Palestinians are homophobic. Well, no. I want to read you this article from The Nation that is titled "Gaza's Queer Palestinians Fight to Be Remembered," which is really sad already. That's a really sad title, but yeah, we're going to have to dive into this one, buddies. I'm going to read one paragraph for this next section. Quote, "Israel's far-right government, despite aligning itself with homophobic powers around the globe, insists that the Israeli state is a haven for LGBTQ people, in contrast with Palestine, where it is implied no queer person would last even a day. This pinkwashing is part of Israeli propaganda that erases the existence of queer Palestinians." Israel's pinkwashing not only implies that there are no LGBTQ Palestinians, but also that they cannot possibly be accepted as they are, where they are. In other words, they must flee to a more quote-unquote civilized society, i.e. white European one. However, LGBTQ Palestinians are finding ways to counter these narratives and make their existence known, even as Israel destroys the world around them. Chief among their outlets is an interactive website, Queering the Map, that allows users to pin stories and memories of their queer and trans experiences all over the world. I highly recommend checking that website out because it's honestly heartbreaking. I'm going to read you a few of the stories that are listed. They're on a map and the stories are pinned all over the area, but I just want to make it known that it is absolutely heartbreaking. Here's some of the stories. This first one reads, I don't know how long I will live, so I just want this to be my memory here before I die. I'm not going to leave my home, come what may. My biggest regret is not kissing this one guy. He died 2 days back. We are told how much we like each other, and I was too shy to kiss last time. He died in the bombing. I think a big part of me died too, and soon I will be dead. To Eunice, I will kiss you in heaven. I'm tearing up just reading that, oh my god. Here's another one. I've always imagined that you and me, sitting out in the sun, hand in hand, free at last, we spoke of all the places we would go if we could, yet you are gone now. If I had known that bombs raining down on us would take you away from me, I would have gladly told the world how I adored you more than anything. I'm sorry I was a coward. Oh my god. Here's another one. A place where I kissed my first crush. Being gay in Gaza is hard, but somehow it was fun. I made out with a lot of boys in my neighborhood. I thought everyone is gay to some level. Skipping ahead a little bit, I think this next story actually kind of proves a point here. Quote, the first boy I ever kissed lived here. His cousin found out and tried to stab me. I haven't been back since. This is a clear case of homophobia within Palestine, sure, but it wasn't like more than a few minutes ago where a queer Druze woman was described to be killed and stabbed in Israel. Like, the point is clear. Homophobia exists all over the world, not just in Palestine. You simply cannot use homophobia as a justification to bomb the shit out of a very marginalized people group. I'm going to read another article from The Nation because it kind of also proves my point. This is not a story, by the way. Anyway, quote, by painting Palestine and Palestinians as intrinsically homophobic, Palestinian resistance is framed as antithetical to queer liberation, while Israeli occupation is a form of queer salvation. In fact, Israeli security forces have admitted to deliberately threatening and outing queer Palestinians as a tactic to intimidate them into working as informants. That is evil. That is like wickedly evil, my friends. Because if you're going to frame the justification of genocide with homophobia, that's homophobia by the very state that is doing the genocide in the first place. Within the queer community, there is no border dispute. Sure, there is infighting sometimes, but there is no border dispute. There is no state-mandated border that creates an apartheid dynamic between two warring nations. When Marsha P. Johnson threw the first brick, she did not throw the first brick at Palestinians. She did throw it at the police, though. That should tell you everything about the history of the queer movement and the queer people. So even with the homophobia argument, Israel is 100% on the wrong side of history here. So overall, what's my point? Well, it turns out that settler colonialism, genocide, and bombings and war, and foreign affairs, malicious bullshit, like what we're seeing in Israel and Palestine, also with the United States throughout its entire fucking history, let's just be real here, is wildly unpopular. In my anecdotal opinion, I believe that the sympathies for both of these warring nation states, being Palestine and Israel, have flipped. And actually, it's statistically backed up here. According to a poll conducted by Quinnipiac University, among voters between ages 18 to 34, the sympathy rating between Israel and Palestine have flipped between October 17th and November 16th of 2023. October 17 saw Israel at 40%, whereas Palestine was around the mid-20s. That has changed dramatically. November 16, we're seeing 52% for Palestine and 29% for Israel. Meanwhile, according to dataforprogress.org, Democrats support a ceasefire, strongly agree by 40% and somewhat agree by 40%, while Republicans, interestingly, 21% strongly agree that they should have a ceasefire, while 35% somewhat agree that they should have a ceasefire. Even with those slightly on the edge numbers, we have Democrats who at 80% agree and 56% of Republicans agree that there should be a ceasefire. That is, statistically speaking, more than half of all voters in the United States agree that we should have a ceasefire from Israel and not some pissy-ass humanitarian pause. Meanwhile, according to Haaretz.com, Joe Biden's security advisor is going to Israel to discuss putting an oil reserve off the shore of Gaza. If we learned anything from 9/11 with the relationship of Halliburton, Dick Cheney, and Colin Powell making lies about weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, we have learned that the money is always the factor here. It is always for oil, it is always for money, it is always in the name of goddamn motherfucking imperialism, buddies. People will try to argue that this oil reserve will revitalize Palestinian economies, but it does not revitalize Palestinian lives that have been blown to bits. Not to mention, we need to work on our solidarity and our activism here at home in the Americas to pressure the politicians to do a goddamn ceasefire. As an anarchist, I believe the state should be abolished, no questions asked. However, we do not have that circumstance right now. So we need to yell and put a lot of pressure at our political leaders today. There's a YouTuber known as Ron the Anarchist. He's a really good friend of mine for quite many years now. He recently released a video that I think is his best video he's ever done, and you should go absolutely watch the video if you want to find out how to get more directly involved with this kind of anti-war activism. And although it may seem unlikely that any kind of activism will work, Ron argues otherwise. Here's an excerpt.
Ron, why would you go all the way out to DC, which is pretty far away from where you live, to try and influence federal politicians? Something you have said yourself numerous times is pointless. And no joke, that is an excellent question. Because I have said that numerous times over a number of years and in numerous different contexts, and I still believe it. This is something you should ask yourself before engaging in any political action. What are your goals? What are the specific stated goals of the orgs that you are working with? And what are they trying to do with the action that they are performing? Now, I'm not going to speak for the rest of the Palestine Solidarity Working Group. I was a late add-on and was basically a volunteer. And I managed to mess up the one thing that they asked me to do, so maybe I'm not in the best place to do that. I am also not going to speak for the 7 or 8 other orgs that participated in various sit-ins at the Capitol on that day, or the dozens, if not hundreds of different orgs that arranged and participated in the march that occurred on the 4th. I will say that our org was given 3 specific demands to relay to Sanders. First, to demand a ceasefire between Gaza and Israel, or to support a ceasefire as someone else proposed it. Second, to reject the bill that his committee was going over that would have provided arms to Israel. And third, to stop providing arms to Israel altogether, either through an ongoing process or by simply refusing to let such a bill pass through the Senate. That second one is a bit contextual. It was specifically about that bill, but the first one and the third one are very good starting points. We want a ceasefire, not a humanitarian pause. A humanitarian pause means nothing. A humanitarian pause means you're going to give people sandwiches before you bomb them to kingdom come. It's not humanitarian, it's pretending to be humanitarian while you know you have eyes on you. It's not doing nothing, it's worse than doing nothing. It's doing nothing and being proud of it. I will also state that our actions did, not said, but did specific things. Both the sit-ins and the march were escalations. That by itself sends a message. It says that the demands that we are making are not negotiable. It sends the message to politicians that if they are unwilling to fix the thing, then we will fix the thing. And people are doing that. Protesters in Oakland stopped a ship with arms from leaving harbor. Protesters in Connecticut, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and Hamilton shut down arms factories. Fundraisers hosted by Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have been interrupted. BlackRock HQ in New York was shut down for a while. All of this is good. All of these are good steps. There's another thing we did too. We talked to the people in the office. We tried to convince them that what we were doing was effective and necessary. That ended with someone who I'm to understand was the head coordinator of the Sanders campaign, a woman named Misty, storming out of Sanders' office in tears. Shortly afterwards is when everyone got arrested. And one of the things that I heard about later was how somewhere about 100 congressional staffers walked out of Congress and demanded a ceasefire in Gaza. And I would like to think that us going down there and making our case helped them to do that.
Like I said, Ron's a friend of mine. He's amazing. He has a heart of gold, and I strongly recommend you go watch his video and subscribe to his channel. But take his advice, because we need to fight like hell right now, and it's not going to end overnight. We need to be consistent, and we need to escalate this pressure against politicians until they have no other choice but to listen to its own voters. And if we learned anything from American history, it's that settler colonialism is just not viable. We cannot repeat history, and we cannot allow it to repeat history, even by the faceless demagogues that is the pissy nation-state apparatus. Fuck that shit. Because the bottom line here is that if we allow for this genocide to happen to Palestinians, what does that say about what happens in 2025 if a Republican presidential candidate does happen to get elected and Project 2025 is implemented? Telling the state that the people will not tolerate genocide is telling the state that genocide will not happen here at home either. Worldwide, abroad, and at home. No genocide in Pride. None. Nada. From the river to the sea, Gaza will be free. Thank you. Before you go, I just want to quickly say that I'm actually on Spotify now. You can catch Szabocast on Spotify. Also, I have a Patreon and a Ko-Fi. So if you want to support what I do here on YouTube and Spotify, please go ahead and take advantage of those links. Because, hey, you want me to stop being in an echoey room? I'll definitely get onto that so I can buy like a better mic and like soundproof my closet. So yeah, help me out, I guess. But anyway, yeah, thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. This took a few days to make. I mean, more like a week, considering that one, gap between the time that I had to work with no computer. I had to write part of this script on a tablet. It was a little tricky, but whatever. I mean, it's okay. It's all good now. Anyway, take care, y'all. Until next time.